Again, my name is Grant Eckhart. I'm a son of this congregation, grew up here, and now serve in your college ministry, Jacob's Porch at The Ohio State University. Been there for about 10 years. My family still lives here, most of them in the area. And just as a note, if you know of a college student that's going to be somewhere in central Ohio, or even just a young adult from 18 to 25, let them know about Jacob's Porch. We don't only have students from Ohio State, but we have students from Capital and Otterbein and Columbus State and some of the trade schools, or some people just taking a year off. So let them know about Jacob's Porch. I would really appreciate that. You know, one of the things I love about being a pastor is, I think especially coming out of this church, is that there's just a lot of great mentors that I've had. A lot of people that have meant so much to me over the years and still stay in contact with me. I got a call, this is 3 or 4 months ago, from one of the former pastors here, Pastor Josh Nelson. Anybody remember Josh Nelson? Probably 20-some years ago. There's some of you that remember him good. Great, he's serving a church up in the great north somewhere, and he called and said, "Hey, Grant, can you do an adult Bible study series for my congregation?" And I said, "Well, Josh, that's kind of a long drive for me to get up there." And he's like, "No, we're all on Zoom. It's okay." I said, "Oh, of course." And so I did this adult education thing with him, and it was great. And what he wanted to hear about was, he said, "Hey, you work with young people. Can you talk to our congregation a little bit about what they call Generation Z?" Maybe you've heard this, like students that are recently graduated from college to about my kid's age, like late elementary school. And can you just tell us what they're like? And then Pastor Julie, who I'm getting to know and think a lot of her, she kind of said the same thing. Let some people know about your experience with college students. So I said, okay, I guess 2 people said that. We'll go in that direction this morning, and kind of how that intersects with this really important parable in the Gospel of Matthew. So Gen Z and the Gospel of Matthew. So I told Josh, Pastor Josh, that, within Generation Z, the college students I work with, there was just 2 things that I wanted to lift up. That kind of, first of all, Gen Z is not that unlike you. They are humans. They're not aliens. They're very similar to all of us. But there's a couple things that's just a little more, a larger trend in that demographic perhaps than others. This is going back to 2018, I befriended the vice president of student affairs at Ohio State. We would have lunch every once in a while, and she had been doing student affairs for 35 years at the University of Maryland and then Ohio State. And we went out to lunch one day, and I asked her, because she was nearing retirement, I said, "What's one thing that's changed over 35 years that you've seen in higher education and with college students?" And without much hesitation, she said, the incoming freshman class at Ohio State in 2018, 70% of them were medicated for anxiety or depression. And she said 35 years ago, we weren't talking about that at all. There was no services and all that kind of thing. And so one thing about the students I work with, there's just this high kind of anxious energy, and that, kind of filters into what we do as a college ministry. We're much more contemplative now than we used to be. I'm in our college ministry, a little bit quieter and a little bit slower. And as part of that too, students just say they just have this chaos that they feel. They seem to control the world around them because everything just causes anxiety. So that's one thing as a college student. I don't think we need to despair over that. Just acknowledge, we're seeing this. And then the other thing that I mentioned in this adult Bible study was that right now in Generation Z, 48% of Generation Z is what we would call religiously unaffiliated. That means when they take the census surveys, they say they're not affiliated with any religion at all. They're a none, or sometimes we call them spiritual but not religious. So 48%. So when I started college ministry even 10 years ago, certainly back when I was in the youth group here in the early 90s, most people were Christian that I knew. And it wasn't kind of odd to be a Christian, and most people knew at least something about the Bible. Well, probably over half the students that I see that we meet on campus and are part of our ministry. I mean, some are Christians and come from Christian backgrounds, but more and more and more, probably the bulk of the students we see now have no, committed, affiliated faith background, which makes for a wild and interesting time in college ministry, and I love it. It's exciting. And so I think especially since COVID, one thing I noticed, and I noticed this about a year and a half ago, was that so many students were coming in and they were doing these spiritual practices, you might say occult practices. Some are more serious, some are kind of innocuous, but I have students coming on our Christian retreat, where we go away for a weekend and they bring, tarot cards. And I was like, I've never seen tarot cards on a Christian retreat before. Okay. And then I started to ask, how many of you were, doing these things? And most of the hands went up with, the zodiac or something called angelic numbers. I'd never heard about that, where you look at a clock and something like if the minute hand is at the up half of the hour, it's going to be a good hour, or something like that, something kind of bizarre like that. And, everybody's like, and I looked at my staff, and one of my staff members was like, oh, I do tarot. I was like, really? I didn't know that. And then I just kind of got curious. So, how I handle situations usually is I first study a lot. I love to study and learn. So I read 2 big books on occult practice or, spiritual practices, and learned all the history and the background. Most of these practices aren't nearly as ancient or old as most of these students thought. And I think during the pandemic, they all got on YouTube, and they started to learn about these things. And of course, you believe everything, you see on YouTube. They're all factually correct, right? So I thought, okay, my role is going to be explain to them what these things are and whatnot. So I explained it to them, and, they didn't seem very, interested in the background or in these spiritual practices they had. And ultimately, one by one, kind of on one Sunday night, I said, well, why do you do these things? Because it's 48%, only 3 to 4% are atheists of this group. Most of them are open to some kind of spiritual practice, right? There's a huge spiritual openness. We think nobody's interested in religion. No, they're all really spiritually open. They just don't know much about Christianity, and so they're picking out these other things. And I said, so why do you do, what's interesting about tarot, zodiac? Because instead of condemning it outright, as in my generation it might have happened, or saying it's totally of the devil, I'm taking an approach of this. Let me ask you questions, and to keep you here where I can talk to you about this. Let me show some curiosity, and let me continue also to share about who Jesus Christ is. And we're just going to see how that goes. Curiosity rather than condemnation. So they said, well, Pastor, we don't really care about the history of these or what the spiritual practice is. Why we do these spiritual practices is because we just want to remind ourselves that there's something more to this world. More than the homework I got to get done, the money I've got to earn, the pain I'm feeling. I can get so bogged down. I just want to remember by looking at a clock or looking at the stars or doing something that there's more to this world than what I can see, taste, and touch. There's a bigger story going on. And I don't know what that story is, but I just need to be reminded that there's more. And I said, I totally get that. And I think these parables are getting at that as well. I mean, what does Jesus talk about here in Matthew 13? He's talking about the kingdom of heaven, a bigger reality, something going on. He talks about the mustard seed that once implanted begins to flourish and grow. Talks about the treasure in the field that once discovered is worth selling everything for to purchase all the land around it. Or the pearl of great price. What is that pearl of great price? That most important thing under whose shadow everything else falls. And of course, that last parable with the net that is cast that sifts the good from the evil. At the end, this gathering, this growing, something that's so valuable that you sell everything for. Jesus is telling these parables to clue them into something. And interesting, the thing that he's trying to clue them into actually isn't included in the reading. It's that little part that's cut out of it. I don't know why the people who make these lectionaries do that, but what he said in there was, Jesus said, why do I tell you these parables? Why is Jesus doing this? Why is he talking about this stuff? He says, I'm telling you these parables to remind you of something that has been hidden since the creation of the universe. Why is he talking about these pearls, these nets? To remind each of us about something that has been hidden since the creation of the universe. Okay, now what does that have to do with anything we've talked about so far? When we have a college student come in, they're a little weary of a religion thing, but they're kind of open. They've had that first step of some kind of awareness of there's something more, I need to go investigate it. Maybe our church name is just weird enough, Jacob's Porch, that they're like, well, maybe that weird is like my weird, and I can figure something out. And they come in, and as I'm talking to them, the first thing I usually hear is, I'm not a Christian, I don't know if I'll ever be, but I just need to be reminded of one thing. And this is something I need to be reminded of. See, I need to be reminded that the world is an enchanted place. I hear that all the time. It's not disenchanted. It's not just the material, the machine, the only what we can see. That there's a bigger enchanted narrative with celestial bodies and heavenly realms. There's a creator. There's a son who has descended and ascended. There's a spirit that is alive and calling and moving in us. This is an enchanted story, this one we have in Scripture. We too often take all the cool stuff, all the miracles out, and just get down to just what is the teaching. Well, the teachings are important, but it's an enchanted worldview. And the students appreciate it when I lean into that. I don't try to strip it all away and disenchant this story, because for them, it produces that anxiety and depression. Is this all that there is? I work until I die, and maybe there's something called heaven, I don't know. Or is this world teeming with a spiritual reality as described in the Bible? Well, once they get opened up to that there's an enchanted world, then the next thing that typically happens, at least to anecdotally the students that I have at Jacob's Porch, is I begin to hear things like this. And maybe you've thought this, and maybe you've heard students say this, or people. It's, well, I think the universe is going to be good to me today. You hear that? It's almost like a non-Hindu form of karma. I put something out into the universe, and I'm going to get it back. I think the universe is going to show me a path. It's all well and good. I hear that all the time from students. And as they begin to trust me and we talk more, I start to say, how do you know the universe is benevolent and is good? Have you seen the universe? Well, I just trust the universe will show me the right path. And you kind of get into a lot of spiritual language. And I don't denigrate them for this. I don't coerce them into Christianity, but I listen. I'm curious. And I continue to tell a different story. And sometimes it gets around to, okay, you believe in this spiritual realm. Honestly, it kind of feels like what I imagine the 1960s to have been like right now. There's lots of these spiritual practices and lots of psychedelic drug use going on right now. And so it's kind of an interesting time. And so these students begin to say, there's other spiritual creatures, other spiritual realms. Now hang with me. I'm a college pastor. This is how I talk to college students. This might sound super weird, and it is, but they asked me to talk to you like I talk to college students. So hang with me. They start to believe in the other realms, these things they have seen. And I say, okay. Well, the God that I believe in was courageous enough not to live behind the shadows or to remain unseen, to leave us to guess whom you are worshiping or praying to. The God we see in Jesus Christ became incarnate and revealed to us exactly who God is. Jesus, who is fully divine and fully human, we see what divinity is like, and we're left with no question. We see sacrificial love. We see steadfast mercy. We see forgiveness. And ultimately, we see that in this God, the one who is revealed and doesn't hide behind the shadows, the undescript universe, the one who came into this world, was crucified as a treasonous slave, punished by the people around him, who died, but because life cannot be contained by death, broke the bounds of death and destroyed them, was resurrected from the dead and has ascended to the Father, that all might see and know him fully revealed and manifest, not hiding, but showing what true love looks like. And so my job as a campus pastor, I don't believe evangelism for me isn't so much teaching them a new thing, a new story. Actually, what it is to remind them what has been hidden from the creation of the universe. I believe that they have a deep and ancient memory within them. They actually know who they are. They actually know who God is. They actually know who Jesus Christ is. And it takes time to sit with them, to tell the story, and kind of to do memory therapy. Because I'm not teaching them a new story, I'm reminding them of an old one that is more core to them than their own DNA. Their entire body and soul cries out for this God that they can recognize and be reminded of who they are. That's 90% of what my job is, to remind them. And what do we do here, at least in sacramental churches where we have the Eucharist? What kind of things do we do there? We do lots of memory work, don't we? The entire first part of the Eucharistic liturgy that I'll do in a moment is called the anamnesis, the reminding, the memory, where I'm going to go through and remind you of the deeds of this God that we worship. And then what do I say in the Eucharistic liturgy during the words of institution? This is my body, this is my blood. Do this in remembrance of me. Most of what we are doing here, as well as what I'm doing on the college campus, is this memory therapy, reminding people, not something new, but something old, that when they sit with it long enough, they know to be true. There are students that will get to the point of just thinking the world's enchanted. That will satisfy them, their spiritualness, and they'll leave, but many stay. Some will get to the point where, okay, it's not just a general enchantment, but there is a creator of the universe behind, and I'll trust this universe. And they're satisfied and they leave, but many stay. And for those that stay, and one reason I love college ministry so much is that over and over and over again, for those who stay and do this memory work and hear the story, if they sit with it just long enough, I see that light go off. And it's the light of, now I remember. I remember the Ancient of Days who knew me in my mother's womb and created me from the foundations of the universe. I recognize in Jesus Christ, my sovereign Lord. I know now who I am created to be and how I'm to walk a path in this life. And then they forget, but then they remember. Because one thing I've noticed is that in all the news of people leaving the church and deconstructing their faith, that's true. Because faith can be a fragile thing, we can forget. But I'll tell you what, because I see this all the time, unbelief is at least as fragile. You hear what I mean there? Sure, people might walk away from the faith. There might be a fragility there where they can walk away from the faith, but people can walk away from non-faith and unbelief even easier, because when they get to that place, they have that deep sense of, this just doesn't feel right. There has to be more. and they begin the other kind of trajectory. So my prayer this morning for all of us is that we would remember who we are. At the deepest, most ancient levels of who we are, that which has been hidden since the beginning, the creation of the universe, something that you know deep within yourself. And that either with your child or grandchild or neighbor, that you would be able to sit with them long enough, even when they're going off around all these spiritual practices and things they found on YouTube, sit with them long enough to be able to share the real story. Because I believe they will recognize it for what it is, as something true. Because Jesus Christ was raised from the dead, and the same Spirit that raised him from the dead dwells in each of you, dwells in me, and dwells in all these students and people we love. And let us remember that. Amen.